All right, welcome everyone. We're excited to welcome Dr. Stephen Quay to be our speaker for today. He's going to speak today on equitable engagement. Dr. Quay is from The Ohio State University, and he's got quite a few accomplishments that make him an exciting speaker for today. He's the editor of the Journal of Higher Education. He's also done quite a bit of work with inclusion and equity in higher education. His research concentrates on engaging students in difficult dialogues about privilege, power, and oppression, and the strategies educators can use to facilitate productive dialogues around those topics. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Quay. Welcome, Dr. Quay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you. I know it's December and the end of the semester, so I'm especially grateful for folks making the time to join this afternoon. And for those who will be watching this later as well, thank you for taking the time to do that. So yes, I just want to say a few more things about myself, and then I will go ahead and get started. So whenever I do a talk, I like to share 3 things around my teaching and facilitation philosophy, because I just really think it's important that you know like the values that I bring to the work that I do and what guides what I do. So the first thing is I really believe strongly in practicing and modeling vulnerability. I'm a big proponent that when we practice vulnerability, we give people permission to do the same. A lot of the courses and topics that I talk about around issues of race, class, gender, privilege, power, oppression, they're topics that I think are really hard to talk about because people are worried about saying the wrong thing or offending somebody. And so it requires, I think, a lot of practicing vulnerability to know that we might make mistakes in the process, but I just ask that we keep going because, again, it's really important for us to do that. So that's number 1 for me. Secondly, is I believe strongly in paying attention to power. And I'm going to talk about power at some point today. Power is always present in our relationships with each other, whether or not we're aware of how power shows up. And so for me, in order to have these kinds of dialogues around trying to create equitable environments for students, we really have to pay attention to the power that each of us brings to the space. So that's number 2. And then lastly, I mentioned a number of the topics that I talk about can be really challenging. Yet I think it's still possible to foster joy in the process of learning. That's something that I also try to embody as an educator, is to really have joy in the process of talking about these hard topics, because I think that's what enables us to really grapple with them and internalize them. So again, practicing and modeling vulnerability. Number 2, paying attention to power. And then number 3, fostering joy in the learning process. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so let me give you a sense of how we're going to spend our time for like the next 55 minutes or so. So I'm talking today again around this topic of creating equitable environments for fostering student engagement. So the way in which we're going to do that is I want to start by just talking more broadly. I want to spend some time just talking through some demographic details around North Dakota State University, and then shift to talking through some key terms. I'm a strong proponent that we can't address the problem in the room if we don't know what we're talking about. So I really want to talk about some of the terms and language that I'll be using throughout the talk here this afternoon. Then I'm going to talk through some application pieces. So for you, I'll spend some time applying what I've been talking about. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of the remaining time on this 4-stage intergroup dialogue process. And I'll talk more about what intergroup dialogues is in just a moment. And then we'll conclude with what I call around conducting an equity audit of our teaching, or questions or things to pay attention to in order for us to create more equitable environments for fostering student engagement. So with that, let me talk through just some broad demographic information in a moment. First, I actually want you to do this activity. So I want you to think about your classroom. So many of you are likely teaching class this semester or have taught in the past. So I want you to just think of your classroom. So just take a moment and either draw this on paper or just in your head, imagine your classroom space. So think about the desks or the seats in your space. How are they arranged? What do they look like? Where do you, as the instructor, position yourself in the classroom? So where are you typically situated in this space? What are the demographics of the students in your classes? So their different identities, their backgrounds, their experiences. And then with whom do you see students in your classes interacting? So just take about 30 or so seconds. And I just want you to, again, envision your classroom, or just take some time to physically draw your classroom based on these questions. Okay, So keep this image at the forefront of your mind throughout the talk here today. As I'm thinking about my class, so the image I had in my head here is I'm teaching a class this semester. So I work at Ohio State University. I'm a graduate faculty member. So I work primarily with graduate students, master's, PhD, and EDD students. These are students who want to work at a college or university when they're done with their graduate studies in the various co-curricular services on campus. So some actually might be working, for example, in an office of teaching and learning. Some might be working in the Office of Residence Life as a resident advisor, as a hall director. Some might be working in student activities, in academic advising, in fraternity and sorority life. So again, a number of the places on campus that serve as co-curricular opportunities for undergraduate students is what my program is designed to help students prepare to do. So I'm teaching a class this semester called Facilitating Intergroup Dialogues in Higher Education, where the goal of this class is really to help students understand how to go about facilitating dialogues about difficult topics. And by difficult topics, I mean things like privilege, power, oppression, racism, sexism, religious differences, political differences. Again, topics that are really hard for people because again, they're worried about offending somebody or just not having the language to talk about it. And in my class, I have students sitting around in a circle. So there are 20 students in this class. And for me, the reason for that is because I want them to actually engage with each other. And if they're sitting in rows or desks, like they're looking at the back of each other's heads, right? And I often position myself very differently in this space. Sometimes I'm in the middle of the circle, right? What's the middle of a circle? A circle really doesn't have a middle. But sometimes when I'm in the classroom, right? I just choose different seats, right? Spots to again position myself differently so that I have a different vantage point and just to get students outside their comfort zones. So I have that image of my classroom as I teach. I know some of you might be teaching larger lecture classes. Some of you might have 50 students in your class, right? So I just want you to have that image of your classroom at the forefront of your mind, because I think then you have a context in which to apply some of the things that we're talking about here this afternoon to it. So now that we have this image of the classroom in our mind, let's talk about what this might look like based on our demographics here at NDSU, right? So none of this is likely going to be surprising to any of you, right? So NDSU as a whole, like many institutions in higher ed, is predominantly white, right? I used to work at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, before coming to Ohio State. Around 82% of the faculty at Miami were identified as white. Around 88% of students identify as white. Ohio State, additionally, is also a predominantly white institution. The racial demographics there are a bit better, but generally speaking, like predominantly white institutions have similar demographics, right? So here at NDSU, right, among your faculty, around 73% identify as white, around 20% identify as Asian, 2 or more races is 1%, right? And then when it comes to gender, we have around 60% identify as men, 40% as women. What is not here, right, are maybe folks who identify as gender non-conforming or non-binary, right? So this is very much a binary men, women, right? Not everyone identifies in that way, right? So I want to point that out because that's not included in these data. So again, we see this picture of the faculty. When we look at students, it's fairly similar. So students here. So again, 81% of students identify as white. We have about 5.5% of Asian students, right? Black, about 4%. So again, similarly here, I share these demographic data because I want us to have a larger picture of what we're talking about here when we think around the demographics and how that might play a role in the students who are in your classes as well. Many of your classes are likely going to reflect, right, the larger demographic of the institution. So a couple of conclusions here, right, which is what I've just said, that white students comprise the majority of students, white faculty comprise the majority of faculty. And so what that means for me, as somebody who's not affiliated with NDSU and coming in from an outsider perspective, right, the conclusion that I draw from this is, given these demographic data, I think there's a need to be mindful of the experiences of students of color in particular, because again, they're an underrepresented group at NDSU, right? And so when we're thinking about creating equitable environments for students, we have to be mindful of the different kinds of experiences that students of color in particular might be having on a campus where they are underrepresented. So that's one sort of big conclusion around these demographic data. That then gets me into part 2 of my talk here this afternoon, which is now let's talk through some key terms. So I'm talking about equitable environments for student engagement. There's a couple of key words here. We have equity is one of the key words there, and then engagement, right? So we begin with the difference between involvement and engagement. So I'm talking about engagement, not involvement. So one of the key areas in my field is the distinction between involvement and engagement. So many of us would say that we want students to be engaged on campus. And let me talk about this distinction in just a moment. So involvement here is we're talking merely about students who are attending specific events. So we might ask an undergraduate student at NDSU, so tell me about your involvement on campus. And they might say something like, well, I'm the president of this student organization. I also am a big sister for the organization Big Brothers and Big Sisters. I also am in a sorority. I also am doing Teach for America, right? They might list some of the things that they're doing outside of class that illustrates that they're involved, right? But if I were to ask them, well, to what extent do you feel like you're engaged, right? That's a different question. That's a qualitatively different question. So it's conceivable that you can be involved in all of these activities. You attend all of these meetings, you do all of these things, but involvement is a qualitatively different step. Involvement means that you are participating in what researchers call educationally effective practices that lead to a range of outcomes. So as faculty, some of the outcomes that we might think are important for students to develop, one big one that comes to mind is critical thinking skills. I've never met a faculty member who says to me, I don't really want students to develop critical thinking skills in my class, right? That seems to be something that many of us agree upon, that that's important for students to develop, right? We want them to be mindful, to be critical of the world around them, to pay attention, to not just accept, perspectives at face value, but to understand why they believe what they believe, right? So to me, for example, as for politics, I'm not interested in just a student voting Republican or Democratic or independent. I want them to know why they're choosing to support this candidate, why they're choosing to vote in this way, right? Why they're being civically engaged. So that's another outcome, right? So we have critical thinking skills, we have civic engagement. We might also say we want students to be able to interact with those who are different from them, right? That's another sort of like thing that we might want them to achieve an outcome. So again, engagement is specifically practices that lead to these outcomes that we as educators want students to have, which is different from involvement. It's a qualitatively different step. So that's number one. Then let's talk through some other key terms. So I mentioned one of my core values is around paying attention to power, right? So let me talk about that right now. So power often comes in two different forms. We have formal power. This is based on your title or position. And we have informal power. This is based on our social identities. So our social identities are things like our race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, etc., right? And this comes in often dominant identities, which are identities in which one experiences privilege or power. And then minoritized or subordinated identities are the identities in which we experience oppression. So let me give some examples of these 3 or 4 terms here. So I, as a professor at Ohio State, I hold more formal power than students in my classes because my title as professor gives me formal power over students in my classes. Another example here is that Stacy, as the director of the Office of Teaching and Learning, holds more formal power in her title than, for example, the assistant director does, right? The president of NDSU holds more formal power than, for example, a dean does, right? So formal power is, again, tied to our position or title. Informal power, though, is based on our social identities. So I have some dominant identities and I have some minoritized or subordinated identities. One of my most important identities to me is the fact that I identify as Black, right? There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about what it means to be Black when I move through the predominantly white spaces that I occupy, right? On any given day, I likely interact with more white folks than I do people of color, more Black people in particular, because of the context in which I'm situated. So that's an identity that's minoritized because I get less power from being Black than, for example, a white person does. right? White folks have more informal power in our society because whiteness is a dominant identity. There's privilege that comes with being white. However, I also identify as a cisgender man, right? I say cisgender because the sex male that I was assigned at birth matches the way that I express my gender identity. For some people who identify as transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary, the sex that they were assigned at birth doesn't match their gender identity, right? I also am educated. I also am middle class. I also identify as heterosexual. So these are other dominant identities that I hold that merges with my minoritized racial identity. So the reason that I share this level of detail is to point out that all of us are positioned differently from each other. And this matters because, again, of when we're trying to create equitable environments, we have to acknowledge that the students in our classes are coming into our classes with a mix of different identities and backgrounds and experiences, right? And so if we know that we're in a class with 25 students and only one student in that class identifies as a student of color, right, that student might feel very isolated in our classroom environment. And if we're not paying attention to these social identities and the power, then we might inadvertently do things that create more isolation for that student, right? So I think being mindful of our own identities, being mindful of our power, enables us to think about how we might create more equitable environments for those students in our courses. Which then brings us to the difference between diversity, inclusion, and equity. So diversity, these are terms that many universities use, right? Is literally how many people of X identity do we have in the room? So these demographic data that I showed you earlier, right? This is telling you diversity. We know there's 458 white faculty. It's a raw number. There's also a percent, right? That's diversity. And the next level, though, is if we're paying attention to inclusion, we're not just interested in how many people of X identity we have in the room. We're also trying to pay attention to the extent to which those voices and experiences in the room matter. So it's not just that we care about that they are present, but now we're actually valuing their voices and experiences. So that's another level. The most important level that I think, and the hardest I think to get to, is equity. This is giving people what they need to succeed. And I think this image in particular really captures the difference between equity and equality. So when we look at this image here, we see on my left-hand side, this image of equality. Equality, the definition of that is that we give everybody the same thing. We treat everybody the same, right? So in this image, we have 3 boxes. We've given each of these 3 people the same box. It's the same height, it's the same color, the same shape, etc. What we notice, though, is that if we give everybody the same thing, it doesn't mean that everybody is going to achieve or succeed, because people need different things in order to succeed, because again, they have different barriers to their success. So in the image on the right, you see that the person who's the shortest needs something different. That person needs extra boxes in order to be able to see over the fence. The person who's the tallest, however, they don't need any boxes. So we don't have to give that person anything for them to be able to succeed. And then the person who's the medium height, right, they just need 1 box to be able to see over the fence. So again, equity means you give people different things. So if boxes is what we're giving people something to succeed, we give people more boxes who have different life circumstances that means they have started from a different position, right? Because again, that's what privilege is telling us, that some folks have started from a different place based on an unearned advantage that they have merely because of the skin color that they're born into, for example, right? So that's the difference between equity and equality. Now, some might look at this image and say, well, we need to just even remove the fence, right? What if we just got rid of the fence in general? Because the fence is the barrier, right? So even if we give people what they need to succeed, there are still these barriers in place. But what happens if we actually try to remove those barriers so that everyone has what they need in order to be able to succeed? So again, the terms here are formal power, or involvement engagement, formal power, informal power. dominant and subordinated identities, and then diversity, inclusion, and equity. So what I want you to do now is I want you to take one of these key terms that I've just talked about, and I want you to reflect on this question. How does knowing this term help you think differently about how you teach? So again, as a reminder, the terms are involvement, engagement, formal power, informal power, dominant identities, subordinated identities, and then diversity, inclusion, and equity. So again, take about a minute and reflect on this question. So take one of the key terms and then think, how does knowing this term help you think differently about how you teach? Okay, so we're on part 3 now. So I've been talking a bit about, we started off with just sharing I asked you to draw your classroom as an example and have that at the forefront of your mind. Then we talked through some broad demographic data around the demographics of your campus. Then we shifted to talking through some specific terms around equity, diversity, involvement, engagement, formal power, dominant identities, right? So now we're in part 3, which is through how might we put all the pieces I've been talking about into a specific model that helps us think about how to create equitable environments for foster engagement for students in our classes. So one of the most useful models that I have, and at this point, 2003, right? So it's coming up on what, 20 years old at this point next year. And every now and then I say, this thing is old. Should I keep going back to it? And I keep coming back to it because I haven't found anything else that to me is as practical and helpful as we think about the structure of our classes than this model is. And so I share this as a way to help us think concretely about how we might, again, move towards more equitable engagement for students in our classes. So this 4-stage model starts with creating an environment for dialogue. The goal here is to create the conditions conducive for dialogues to occur. Next, we situate the dialogue. Then we explore conflicts and multiple perspectives. And then we move from dialogue to action. I'm going to talk through each of these stages and give some examples around this notion of equitable environments. So let me just give a brief background on intergroup dialogue. So intergroup dialogues is a process for engaging people in dialogues about difficult topics. They're intergroup dialogue because the whole goal here is that they bring 2 groups together that have some tension or conflict as a way to explore the sources of conflict and then find tangible ways to engage in dialogue towards the goal of newfound understanding, right? So if we think about our society right now, many of us would agree that we are living in a society that is very, very divisive, right? Where folks really don't engage with each other. Like the whole goal, when you look at MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, any of the major news stations, is they bring people on for a 7 or 8 minute segment. One side believes this, the other side believes that. They share their perspective, and then they engage in debate to prove why my opponent is flawed and why my perspective is the one that's correct, right? Intergroup dialogue is saying that the whole goal here is around sustained dialogue, is to come to newfound understanding through this 4-stage process. And if we think about the course of a semester, so I teach a class that is 15 weeks. We meet 1 time a week for 2 hours and 45 minutes each week. And so I think of my class structured through this 4-stage intergroup dialogue format. So let's talk through what this might look like. So stage 1, creating an environment for dialogue. So the whole goal of this first stage is to create the conditions for the dialogue that we want to happen to occur. So we have to do certain things to set up the space so that it can occur. So if our goal is to have students, again, develop critical thinking skills or learn to interact with their peers across differences, then we have to create the conditions for that to occur. So one thing that might happen in this stage is to think through some lower risk activities that help students build relationships with each other. So I'll give my class as an example. So I'm in this class where the whole goal, again, is to help students understand how to facilitate and engage in dialogues about difficult topics. So one of the activities that I have students do during the second week of the semester is I call it a stories in the box activity. And I ask students to bring 3 items to class to share with each other. One of those items should reflect a dominant identity that they hold. Another item should reflect a minoritized or subordinated identity that they hold. And then the third item can reflect any identity of their choosing. And they use this as a way to introduce themselves to each other. And again, it's a lower risk activity intended to help them build trust with each other and get comfortable talking about their identities. Because for many of them, this is the first space that they really have to think about, like, what does it mean to be, for example, a white woman in this space? Or what does it mean to be an international student in this space? Or to be a Black student who also identifies as heterosexual, right? So to get comfortable talking about the importance of those identities with them is, again, a way to build some trust with each other. So for me as an instructor, if I'm thinking about your classes, the things I would think about are, think about who is in your class. The whole reason I asked you to draw your classroom at the start was because I wanted you to envision your class in this space, to think about the demographics of your students, to think about who you are as an educator, and then what might you contribute as an instructor. So in the course of a 15-week semester, I usually spend about 3 or 4 weeks on stage 1, because again, I've noticed if I don't spend the time to help students build trust, then the kinds of dialogue that I want them to engage in doesn't happen because they haven't spent the necessary time getting to know each other in these more lower risk ways. So that's stage 1, creating an environment for dialogue. The second stage then is situating the dialogue. So in this stage, you've now spent the time building trust with students in your classes. So now you're asking them to engage in more risky activity, right? So you've spent some time with the more lower risk activity, and now we're trying to help them understand and develop more trust with each other, and then to also then be able to know the topics that they're going to be talking about in this class. So I might include the key terms that are relevant in your field. So hopefully you've seen me trying to model some of this today as well too, right? So I started off with introducing myself a bit so that you got to know me more. That was more lower risk for me. And then I am asking you to think about the key terms that I'm using throughout today's session, right? So similarly, I introduce key terms to students in my classes. Another thing you might do here is to use caucus groups. So caucus groups means that you're bringing together people who have shared identities to engage with each other before bringing them to heterogeneous groups. So sometimes it's really important, for example, around the topic of race, for white people, white students to have space talking with only white students before they interact with their peers of color. Because there are certain things that white students have to have experience talking about with just among themselves. And sometimes students of color also just want the space to be able to talk about issues of race without feeling like they have to do that with white students present. So this is why caucus groups are often important, is because folks can talk about the issues that are relevant to their identity, and then you bring them together in larger cross-racial groups. So some examples here on my slide here is one of the things I noticed when I was prepping for the talk is around your mission, vision, and core values is this focus on inclusivity, right? Value the unique skills, experiences, and identities of each person, continuously improving how we involve, develop, empower, and trust one another. So because this is tied to our mission and values, some key questions here are, to what extent is this mission reflected in your courses, right? Whose voices are heard? Who makes the important decisions in your courses? Who are in the senior leadership positions at the institution, right? Is this value really reflected? So stage 2, you're really asking participants to do some digging around some of the things we believe and see the extent to which that's actually happening in practice. This you also might spend about 4 or 5 weeks on stage 2 before you get to this point around exploring conflicts and multiple perspectives. So now you've built some trust with the group. You've also done some time caucusing, you've done some time exploring the key terms in your discipline. And so now you're gonna just take some more time to dig into those issues that might create some tension or conflict, right? So some topics right now that are really important in our society, right? There's courses at the Supreme Court around affirmative action, right? This comes up every few years, right? We just had in our Senate, they passed, a resolution around same-sex marriage, right? So these are really critical issues that are happening in our society. And they're hot topics, meaning that there's lots of different feelings around these topics in our society. So what are the hot topics in your field, in your profession, in your discipline that you want students to really engage around, right? And so you might ask them some key questions around that to help prompt their thinking around those issues. Then we get to the last stage here, which is moving from dialogue to action. So here you might identify a core issue to tackle further, right? You might also think about what does action look like. As an example here, I mentioned that I teach primarily graduate students, but when I was at Miami University, I did spend 2 years teaching a UNV 101 class, a University 101 class, which was a newly designed class for all first-year students at Miami, where they were supposed to take a class together, multiple sections, right? Around 20 students in each of these sections, designed to help them transition into being college students. I vividly remember that towards the end of this class, like each of the students was to talk about something that they were going to do, some action step that they were going to take beyond this class to keep their learning happening. So I asked students to share with me what their action item was. One of the students raised his hand and said, one of the things I really want to do in this class or after this class is I have this really close friend that I've known since we were like 6 years old. And this friend often tells racist jokes in front of me. And I often feel very uncomfortable when he's sharing this with me, and I never know what to do. So I've decided as a result of this class, the next time that this happens, I'm going to tell my friend that's not okay, and here's why, right? And one of the students in the class said something to the extent of, well, that's not really, like, what's the big deal about that, right? That feels very small to me. And to me, like, I push back on that because the goal here is not to judge the smallness or significance of the action, but it's really to get participants to do something tangible that they can take with them and say, oh, yes, I've done this as a result of this class. So to me, that's what's critical here in stage 4, is not to weigh the significance of the action, but is to actually think about what can we do beyond this space. So again, stage 1 is creating an environment for dialogue. Then we move towards situating the dialogue, exploring conflicts in multiple perspectives, and then moving from dialogue to action. So third application piece here, next reflection question for y'all to spend some time on. So I want you to think about spring 2023, which is coming up, right? So it's your first class of the spring 2023 semester. Based on what you've learned with this 4-stage intergroup dialogue model, like how might you structure this first class session to be attentive to social identities and equity? So again, just take some time to reflect on that question and jot down some ideas or thoughts that you have around. So I've got one more piece here that I'm going to leave some time at the end for any questions that you all might have. So we're going to put all of the pieces together now that I've been talking about today around this last section, which is how we might think of conducting an equity audit of our teaching. So again, if we are invested in equity and not equality, right? We again know the distinction between equity and equality. These are some things that I think we should pay attention to that help us move towards a more of an equity mindset in our courses. One, to me, and I list this one first because I think it's the most important, is to pay attention to our social identities. So I mentioned earlier some of the identities that I hold as a Black cisgender heterosexual man, right? And my different formal and informal power that I get in the classroom from these identities. So I want us to really be thinking about how do my social identities play a role in my teaching, right? We might think to ourselves, well, I teach math or I teach engineering, right? I just deal with numbers. Like, who cares about my identities? This only matters when you're talking about issues of like race, or you're in social work or you're in psychology where identity matters, right? And to me, identity matters irrespective of our discipline, because if students don't see themselves reflected in what they're learning, they might inadvertently believe that people who look like them have not made contributions to their profession. So I really do think it's important for us to reflect on our identities and share those identities with students in our classes. So that's number one. Number two is pay attention to your syllabus. And this goes to what I just said previously. Key question here is, what are the identities of the authors that I assign? So when I look at my syllabus, I'm very intentional that I assign readings that reflect the experiences of women, of people of color, of international people, right? Because I want students to have broad perspectives and to believe and see themselves reflected in what they read. For me, as a person who grew up in predominantly white environments, it was not until my junior year of college at James Madison University that I had for the first time a teacher or professor who was not white. So just think about that. It took 20 years of my educational experience for me to, for the first time, see a Black person in front of the classroom. The reason that I'm a faculty member today is because of Dr. Charles Lockett, my developmental psychology instructor as a 20-year-old undergraduate student. Like, he gave me the belief that if this is something that I wanted to do, that I could also do it. So imagine for a student of color who never sees themselves reflected in their teachers, right? So this is why they have to see themselves reflected in what they read, because representation matters. And if we don't see ourselves reflected in what we're learning about, we might believe that people who look like us did not make contributions to that field. So that to me is like really, really important. Thirdly, is pay attention to your students. So I asked you to draw your class at the start of today. So who are the students in your classes? What are their identities, right? What might be happening in society that affects how they show up, right? So when, the summer of 2020, like, there was a lot of protests around George Floyd, right? That was going on in the spring semester, right? So to what extent are you making space for that in your classes? When things happen in our society, like, we can't just expect students to show up at the door and just leave all of that behind, right? It's going to impact how they're able to show up in our classes. So to what extent are we actually making space for that in our classes for students to process and make sense of it? And then the last two here is pay attention to your teaching. So what modes of instruction do I use? Lecturing, small groups, dialogue. This is not me saying lecturing is inherently problematic or bad, right? It's a teaching technique or tool. It all goes to how you use it, right? But to what extent are we paying attention to our teaching? What kinds of methods are we using to engage students around the topics of our course? And then lastly, pay attention to your assessment. So one key point here is that we often know from research that those who teach courses related to issues of equity and diversity, namely students of color, they often get asked to teach those courses more regularly because it's seen as our work, right? Because people assume that because I identify as Black, it means that anything having to do with race that I'm an expert on, or that it's my work to do that, right? When the reality is, like, we need folks who identify as white to be equally as invested in that kind of work, because often the teaching evaluations of faculty of color who teach those courses are often much lower, because students often penalize them for making them feel, bad about recognizing or acknowledging their privilege for the first time, for example. So this is why it takes all of us to be invested in doing this work. And then what methods do you use to evaluate students' learning? And then are the methods equitable? So again, paying attention to your assessment is the last piece. So again, 1 through 5 here, paying attention to your social identities, number 1. Number 2, paying attention to your syllabus, paying attention to your students, your teaching, and then your assessment. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share there again. So any questions or comments?
My question is, you talked a lot about what you do in your classroom. Mm-hmm. Has your institution encouraged this level of engagement and lens on teaching throughout the institution? Or is this something that you just said, I'm just going to do it, or is it a mixture of both?
Yeah, so really good question. It's a little bit of a mixture of both, with mostly me just saying, I'm just going to do this because it matters to me. So Ohio State is massive. It is very big. It's about 65,000 undergraduate students on campus. So because of that, I think it's very hard to have large institutional beliefs that permeate throughout the whole institution because we're very siloed. So I think within my department, so the yes part of your to your question is that within my department, I think there's a big emphasis on being equitable in our teaching, that then permeates to folks in my department. But not, I would not say the larger Ohio State as a whole. And then I think just for me, I mentioned that professor I had as a undergraduate student. Like that to me is what really set me on this path of like just understanding the significance of that moment, and the kinds of questions that professor asked are the kinds of questions I'd never been asked before. Like to think about my identity in relationship to what I was learning. It's also the first space in which I ever read readings from authors of color, and that was made explicit, and that just, it lit a fire under me in a way that I was not anticipating, because it's the first time that I felt like I'm actually invested in learning because I see my identity reflected in what I'm reading. And because of that, I've made the conscious choice to be very mindful of that in my own teaching, because I've seen how it benefits students when they also see their voices and experiences reflected in the class. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully it gets at it.
I'll ask one. So that analogy and then the picture with the boxes, it's something we talk about often in my background, which is teacher education. But I'm curious if what you say when you get pushback on that. So when somebody says, no, like if I'm teaching this class, everyone gets a box and everyone gets one box. And you know what I mean? Like everyone gets the same amount because I need to be fair. I'm curious if you have a response for that has worked for you.
Yeah, so this is a good question, because fairness often gets in the way of us being able to do this kind of work, because we're seen as giving somebody something extra, right? So I think there are a couple of ways to push back on that. Is I often find asking questions to be quite disarming. So when I'm feeling myself get defensive and I just want to say what I really want to say, like I'll just ask a question because that helps me disarm it. So some things I might ask are like tell me more about that, or I ask people to often reflect on their own upbringing, their background. So let's talk about where you grew up, where you went to school, what kinds of resources did you have or did you not have, right? So I think that is important as well. I also ask people to think about, help me understand why it's not fair, or how are you defining fair. I also think bringing in the concept of justice is important. So when we talk about justice, like what does that mean or look like? And then I also just think specifically, like, let's deconstruct what the box is. I think that's the other thing too, is like, let's talk about your specific class and what is the perceived box that you feel like that everyone should get the same of, right? Because that also helps me understand more deeply what the fair is that they think somebody else is getting extra of. That might also help me then clarify why that is actually not unfair to give somebody more of that box. So those are just some thoughts off my head that I might use to disarm the person or respond.
That's helpful. Thank you.